What if you get a surprise check in the mail?
Bigger than any stimulus payment you saw during the pandemic.
It might sound crazy,
But that's exactly what we're looking at today.
rumors are swirling about the Trump administration.
And the possibility of them issuing these refund checks to millions of Americans.
So why are these checks even on the table?
It all comes down to government overspending.
And the Trump administration's commitment?
To, well, let's just say streamlining how things work in Washington.
To get to the bottom of this,
We'll be looking at a video
where Trump himself lays out these plans
and we'll be pulling in some extra context from NPR
about just how much power a president actually has.
when it comes to spending.
Now, before we get too far into this,
Make sure to subscribe.
that way.
You won't miss any updates.
So let's dive in.
This whole thing started with the Trump administration
So they're
saying
considering these refund checks.
potentially even bigger than those stimulus payments we saw.
And they're saying it's because,
The government's been spending way more than it should.
and a big part of this push.
Is this focus on cutting out waste and fraud?
And they've brought in some serious firepower to help with that.
They're working with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency.
To take a hard look at how federal agencies and programs are spending money
They're going after everything.
from those Social Security checks
That still gets sent out to people who've passed away.
to departments that might have a few too many employees on the payroll.
And it's not just about cutting spending.
Trump's bringing back this idea called impoundment
It's a pretty powerful tool that presidents used to have,
that let them basically refuse to spend money.
even if Congress had already approved it,
But it's definitely sparking some debate.
about whether it's legal.
And if it's really necessary in this situation.
It's definitely going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Now, one of the big examples they keep bringing up,
Is all this money from the Inflation Reduction Act?
billions of dollars were allocated to states and cities.
For all kinds of different projects.
But a lot of that money is still sitting there,
Unspent.
which begs the question,
Does the federal government have the right to reclaim that money?
if it's not being used the way it was supposed to.
It's a tricky situation.
And there are arguments to be made on both sides. Now, before we get too deep into that,
I'm curious.
have you ever seen government waste firsthand?
Maybe a local project that seemed like a total misallocation of funds?
Or a federal program that felt bloated and inefficient?
Let us know in the comments.
We always love hearing your thoughts.
And if you're finding this dive into government spending as fascinating as we are,
Hit that like button.
it really helps others find this kind of information.
All right, so back to these refund checks.
One of the biggest potential sources they're eyeing.
Is overspending in Social Security.
Some estimates put it at a whopping $700 billion.
$700 billion.
I'm not talking about a few misplaced dollars here.
That kind of money.
It points to some serious systemic issues.
How did we even get to this point?
Is it just mismanagement
Outright fraud.
or something else entirely?
It's probably a mix of all of those things.
You've got outdated systems.
Bureaucratic inefficiencies that have built up over time.
And yeah,
Probably some fraud sprinkled in there too.
but untangling all of
And
that,
actually getting that money back.
that's a mammoth task.
And that's where this whole idea of impoundment comes into play.
Right.
It's definitely a bold move
And it's sparking a lot of debate.
about its legality.
And whether it's really the right approach, what is impoundment exactly?
It's basically a presidential power.
That lets the president say,
You know what?
I'm not spending this money that Congress approved.
Historically, it's been a point of contention.
Between the president and Congress,
And one of the most famous examples,
involved President Nixon
he used impoundment a lot,
to try to control spending that he disagreed with.
which ultimately led to a big legal battle.
And a new law,
The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974.
which was designed to limit the president's power when it came to impoundment,
So if there are already laws in place,
to restrict impoundment.
how is the Trump administration planning to use it in this situation?
That's the million-dollar question.
It's likely going to involve some legal challenges.
And arguments about the specific circumstances surrounding these unspent funds.
This raises a crucial question.
For all of you out there,
Have you ever personally experienced or witnessed what you'd consider government waste or inefficiency?
it could be anything from a local project to a federal program.
Share your thoughts.
We'd love to hear about it.
Right, so another key area the administration is focusing on,
Is those unspent funds?
from programs like the Inflation Reduction Act,
Billions of dollars were allocated to states and cities.
for all sorts of projects.
But a lot of that money is still just sitting there unused.
And that raises a really interesting question.
Should the federal government be able to reclaim that money?
If it's not being used for its intended purpose,
It's a complex issue.
with valid arguments on both sides,
On one hand,
you could say that states and cities should have the autonomy.
to decide how those funds are used.
Maybe they have other more pressing needs.
But on the other hand,
You have the federal government's responsibility.
to make sure that taxpayer money is being used effectively.
And this whole situation really highlights
The interconnectedness of the different levels of government.
federal, state, and local.
It's a complex web.
And pulling on one thread.
Can have unexpected consequences elsewhere.
So let's talk about those potential consequences.
What could be the economic impact of these refund checks?
We've seen stimulus payments before.
But this feels different.
You're right, it's not a direct comparison.
Stimulus checks were meant to provide immediate relief.
During a crisis,
These refund checks are being framed more as...
a return of misspent funds.
But wouldn't they still have a stimulative effect?
On the economy,
Putting more money in people's pockets?
usually leads to increased spending.
That's the theory, at least.
Okay, so let's say the administration manages to reclaim hundreds of billions of dollars
And they decide to distribute it as $2,000 checks.
to every taxpayer,
That sudden influx of cash could lead to a surge in spending.
potentially boosting businesses across different sectors,
People might use that money to pay off debts.
make home improvement.
Or even invest in their own businesses.
Right.
And all of that economic activity could create jobs
Increase demand for goods and services.
and potentially lead to economic growth. But
There's always a but.
didn't we see inflation spike after those pandemic stimulus checks went out?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Injecting a huge amount of money into the economy
Can lead to increased demand,
that outpaces supply.
which could drive up prices.
So it's a delicate balance.
Too much stimulus could trigger inflation.
But too little might not have the impact they're hoping for.
Exactly. The Trump administration is trying to walk a tightrope here.
And it's going to require careful planning.
And execution.
Speaking of careful planning,
Let's talk about the role of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. They're the ones tasked with finding those areas of wasteful spending.
and streamlining how the federal government operates.
They've got a big job ahead of them.
We're talking about a massive bureaucracy.
Countless programs, departments, and agencies.
And they're not just looking at the big ticket items like Social Security.
They're also scrutinizing smaller programs and contracts.
Looking for any instance of overspending.
Or inefficiency.
One area they're really focusing on
is federal staffing.
Personnel costs make up a significant portion of the federal budget.
And there's been a lot of talk about potential overstaffing in certain areas.
It's not hard to imagine how a bureaucracy as big as ours
Could become a little bloated over time.
So how is this department tackling this issue?
They're taking a multi-pronged approach
They're streamlining the hiring process.
to make sure they're getting the most qualified candidates.
Makes sense. You want to make sure you're getting the best people for the job.
Absolutely.
And they're also exploring ways to reduce the overall size of the federal workforce
Through things like attrition,
and potentially targeted reductions.
that's probably going to be met with some resistance.
But if they can find ways to make the government more efficient,
Without cutting essential services.
it could free up a lot of resources.
Exactly. Every dollar saved.
Is a dollar that can be used for other priorities.
Whether it's tax relief,
Or even those refund checks we've been talking about.
this whole conversation brings up a fundamental question.
About the role of government.
What is the appropriate size and scope of government?
Should it be lean and minimal?
Or should it play a more active role in providing services and regulating different aspects of our lives? It's a debate that's been going on for centuries,
And there's no easy answer,
but it's a conversation worth having.
especially in light of these proposed refund checks.
If the government really is overspending by hundreds of billions of dollars,
It raises questions about how that money's being used.
and whether it's being allocated effectively
It also highlights the importance of transparency.
and accountability. If taxpayers are going to trust the government with their money,
They need to know it's being used responsibly.
absolutely, we need to be able to track how our tax dollars are being spent
Hold our elected officials accountable.
and demand efficiency and transparency.
And that's where an informed citizenry comes in.
We need to be engaged
Ask questions.
and demand better from our leaders.
This all ties back to something we talked about earlier.
The potential economic impact of these refund checks.
It's not just about the immediate boost in spending.
It's about the bigger message it sends.
You're right, if these checks are framed as a return of misspent funds,
It could signal a shift in how the government views its role in the economy.
it could suggest a move towards a more hands-off approach,
Less government spending,
less intervention.
and that would have a huge impact on everything.
From social programs to infrastructure projects to regulations on businesses.
It's a lot to unpack.
And it's going to be fascinating to see how this all unfolds.
Absolutely. The stakes are high.
And the potential consequences are far-reaching.
This is definitely a story worth following closely.
And speaking of following closely,
If you're enjoying this dive into the potential for refund checks,
and the implications for government spending,
hit that like button and subscribe.
so you don't miss any future episodes
We appreciate you helping us spread the word.
and spark these important conversations.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our discussion,
I want to bring it back to the human element
it's easy to get caught up in the economic theory,
and the political debates.
but these decisions impact real people.
Sure, right. Let's not forget that.
Imagine getting a $2,000 check in the mail.
For some people, that could be life-changing.
It could help them catch up on bills
Pay off debt.
or even invest in their future,
For others, it might be a nice bonus.
but not a game changer.
And for some,
It might raise questions about whether that money could have been better spent elsewhere,
maybe on improving schools
fixing roads.
or providing health care.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
And it's important to consider all the different needs and perspectives out there.
And that's why these conversations are so crucial.
We need to hear from everyone.
From those who would benefit directly from these checks
To those who believe the funds should be used differently.
It's about finding a balance
A way to address the concerns about overspending.
while also making sure the government is meeting the needs of its citizens.
It's a complex challenge,
And there's no easy solution.
but by having these discussions
Considering different viewpoints,
and demanding accountability from our leaders,
we can work towards a better future.
now let's shift gears a bit.
And talk about another important aspect of all of this,
The ethical considerations.
surrounding these refund checks. And the idea of reclaiming unspent funds.
This is where things get really interesting.
As we delve into the moral and philosophical implications,
Of these policy decisions,
on the surface, the idea of returning misspent funds to taxpayers.
might seem like a no-brainer.
But when you start digging deeper,
You run into a lot of ethical dilemmas.
for example, let's think about those unspent funds.
From programs like the Inflation Reduction Act,
Should the federal government really have the authority,
to take back that money from states and cities?
even if it was already allocated for specific projects?
That's a tough one.
On the one hand,
You could argue that the federal government has a responsibility.
to make sure taxpayer money is being used efficiently and effectively.
But on the other hand,
You have the issue of local economy.
states and cities might have good reasons for not spending that money yet.
They might be facing unforeseen challenges.
Or they might have just decided to prioritize other projects.
And what about the people who are supposed to benefit from those funds?
If those projects were designed to help specific communities,
Wouldn't taking that money back potentially hurt those communities?
yeah, it's a complicated web of competing interests.
And it's not easy to untangle,
Every decision has potential consequences.
both positive and negative.
And it's crucial to weigh those consequences carefully.
So how do we navigate this ethical minefield
How do we balance accountability
with local control?
and the well-being of communities?
There's no easy formula.
But I think it starts with open and honest dialogue,
We need to have conversations like this.
where we explore different perspectives
Consider the potential impacts of our decisions.
and try to find solutions that benefit everyone.
And it also takes a willingness to compromise.
No one is going to get everything they want in this situation.
There will need to be give and take.
And a recognition that sometimes the best solution,
Is the one that serves the greater good.
even if it means making some sacrifices,
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance,
a way to address the concerns about overspending.
while also ensuring that the government is meeting the needs of its citizens. So this brings up another big question.
What are the alternatives to these refund checks?
If the government really wants to tackle overspending,
Are there other ways to use those funds?
that might be more beneficial in the long run,
That's an excellent question.
one that deserves careful thought.
Instead of just giving that money back to taxpayers,
The government could invest it in areas
that could yield long-term benefits.
like what?
Well, they could use it to improve infrastructure.
Things like roads, bridges, and public transportation,
Or they could invest in education,
providing more resources for schools and teachers,
making college more affordable.
expanding access to early childhood education.
And we can't forget about healthcare.
Those funds could be used to make healthcare more affordable
Invest in medical research.
and address the rising cost of healthcare.
There's so many possibilities.
It really comes down to priorities.
What do we as a society value most?
Where do we want to see our tax dollars invested?
And this brings us back to civic engagement.
We need to make our voices heard
Let our elected officials know what matters to us.
and hold them accountable.
For making decisions that reflect our values, it's not enough to just complain about government waste or inefficiency.
We need to be active participants in shaping the future of our country.
We need to be part of these discussions
Advocate for the policies we believe in.
and work together to create a better tomorrow. It's a real balancing act.
Try to find that sweet spot between federal oversight.
And giving states and cities the freedom to do their thing.
This whole situation really shows
How interconnected everything is.
Yeah, you've got the feds, the states, the cities.
It's all one big tangled web.
And if you pull on one thread,
Who knows what'll happen?
exactly, you could end up unraveling the whole thing.
So let's talk about those potential consequences.
What could these refund checks actually mean for the economy?
It's a good question.
I mean, we've seen stimulus checks before.
But this feels different somehow.
You're right, it's not a direct comparison.
Those stimulus checks,
They were all about providing immediate relief
when things were really tough.
during that crisis.
But these refund checks,
They're being presented as,
well, a way to give back money that was misspent.
right, so it's more like
Correct.
than a stimulus.
But even so,
Wouldn't putting all that money back in people's pockets?
still have some kind of stimulative effect.
I mean, usually when people have more money,
They spend more.
and that's good for the economy.
That's the idea anyway,
So let's say
just for the sake of argument.
that the administration manages to get back hundreds of billions of dollars
And they decide to send out $2,000 checks.
to every taxpayer.
What would happen?
Well,
All that cash hitting the economy at once.
could lead to a big surge in spending,
People would be out there buying things.
which would be good news for businesses.
They might use the money to pay off debts.
Maybe do some home improvements.
Or even invest in their own businesses.
It could be a real shot in the arm for the economy,
Creating jobs
boosting demand.
and potentially leading to a period of economic growth. But I know we keep saying, but
There's flip side to this too.
what about inflation?
Didn't we see prices go up?
After those pandemic stimulus checks,
That's a good point.
when you pump a ton of money into the economy,
It can lead to more demand than supply.
and that can push prices up.
So it's a tough balancing act.
The administration has to find that sweet spot,
Enough stimulus to get things moving.
but not so much that it triggers runaway inflation.
It's a tricky situation,
They're walking a tightrope.
and they have to be very careful.
Speaking of being careful,
Let's talk about Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency
those are the folks charged with finding all that wasted government spending.
and making the whole system run more smoothly.
They've got a Herculean task ahead of them.
It's a huge undertaking
We're talking about a sprawling bureaucracy.
with programs and departments and agencies.
It's mind-boggling.
And they're not just focusing on the big ticket items.
Like Social Security.
They're looking under every rock,
Scrutinizing every program and contract.
no matter how small,
Searching for any instance of overspending.
or inefficiency.
They're determined to find every wasted dollar.
And one of their main areas of focus.
Is federal staffing?
Personnel costs are a huge part of the federal budget.
And there's been a lot of discussion about whether some departments are overstaffed.
I mean, it's easy to see
How a bureaucracy as big as ours,
could get a little bloated over time.
you got people coming and going.
Positions being
Hard
created.
to keep track of it all.
So how is this department approaching the issue of federal staffing?
Well, they're trying to be smart about it.
They're not just slashing jobs willy-nilly.
They're looking at it from multiple angles.
What are some of those angles?
Well, first, they're streamlining the hiring process.
Makes sense.
You want to make sure you're getting the best people.
Of the jobs you actually need.
Right.
No point in hiring someone.
If their position isn't really necessary, they're also looking at ways to reduce the overall size of the federal workforce
How are they doing that?
through attrition,
Which basically means...
not filling positions when people leave,
So it's a gradual reduction.
rather than a sudden mass layoff,
And they're also considering targeted reductions.
which would mean
Identifying specific positions or departments.
there could be trimmed without hurting essential services.
That's probably going to be controversial.
There will be people who oppose any kind of job cuts
But if they can find ways to do it strategically
and make the government more efficient,
without sacrificing essential services,
you could free up a lot of money,
money that could be used for other things,
like tax relief,
or infrastructure investments.
or even those refund checks we've been talking about,
It's all about prioritizing.
and making sure every dollar is being used wisely.
This whole conversation raises a big question.
About the role of government.
What should the government be responsible for?
How big should it be?
Should it be involved in every aspect of our lives?
Or should it take a more hands-off approach?
These are questions people have been debating for centuries,
And there's no easy answer.
but it's a debate worth having.
Especially when we're talking about potentially returning hundreds of billions of dollars to taxpayers.
If the government is truly overspending by that much,
We need to ask ourselves some tough questions.
about how that money is being used.
And whether it's being used effectively.
And this brings us to another crucial point,
The importance of transparency.
and accountability.
If we're going to trust the government with our money
We need to know where it's going.
and how it's being spent,
We need to be able to hold our elected officials accountable.
and demand that they use our tax dollars responsibly.
And that's where we, the people, come in,
We have a responsibility to stay informed
to ask questions.
and to demand better from our government.
It's not enough to just sit back and complain
We need to be active participants.
in shaping the future of our country.
This all ties back to the potential economic impact of these refund checks,
It's not just about the immediate effects.
like retrieved spending,
It's about the message it sends.
about the role of government in the economy.
If these checks are seen as a way to correct for government overspending,
It could signal a shift towards a more hands-off approach,
less government spending,
less government intervention
and that could have far-reaching consequences.
for everything from social programs to infrastructure projects to business regulations.
A lot to think about.
And it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out.
This is a story that's just beginning
And it's one we need to follow closely.
because it could have a major impact on all of our lives.
Now, before we move on,
I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier.
the human element,
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture,
the economic theories.
the political debates.
But at the end of the day,
These decisions affect real people.
like you and me,
So let's imagine for a minute.
that you get a $2,000 check in the mail.
What would you do with it?
For some people,
That could be a life-changing amount of money.
it could help them get out of debt
Catch up on bills.
or even start saving for the future,
For others, it might be a nice bonus.
but not a game changer.
And for some people,
It might raise questions about whether that money could have been better spent elsewhere.
Maybe on things like education or healthcare or infrastructure
It's all a matter of perspective.
and priorities.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations.
To hear from people with different viewpoints.
And to try to find solutions that work for everyone.
We need to balance the concerns about government overspending.
With the need to ensure that the government is meeting the needs of its citizens.
It's a complex challenge.
But it's one we need to tackle head on. Now, let's dive into another aspect of this whole refund check situation.
Something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough.
The ethical considerations?
What do you mean?
Well, on the surface,
The idea of giving back misspent money?
seems pretty straightforward.
It's hard to argue with that.
But when you start digging deeper,
You start to run into some tricky ethical questions, like,
what example?
let's think about those unspent funds.
From programs like the Inflation Reduction Act.
Did the federal government really have the power,
To take back that money from states and cities.
even if it was already earmarked for specific projects?
That's a tough one.
It's not a simple yes or no answer.
On one hand,
You could say that the federal government has a duty
to make sure taxpayer money is being used properly.
that it's being spent efficiently.
And that it's actually going towards the intended purpose.
But on the other hand,
You have to consider the issue of local control.
states and cities might have legitimate reasons.
For not having spent those funds yet.
Maybe they ran into unexpected delays.
Or maybe they decided to prioritize other projects.
And then there's the question of who those funds were supposed to benefit.
If those projects were designed to help specific communities,
What happens to those communities?
if the money is taken away,
It's a complicated situation,
with a lot of competing interest,
and there's no easy solution.
every decision has the potential to create winners and losers.
So how do we navigate this ethical minefield
How do we balance your need for accountability
with the importance of local autonomy?
and the well-being of communities?
It's not an easy question to answer.
But I think it starts with having open and honest conversations.
Like this one,
We need to hear from different perspectives
weigh the potential consequences.
and try to find solutions that benefit as many people as possible.
And we have to be willing to compromise.
No one is going to get everything they want.
But if we can find common ground,
And work together,
we can create a system that's fair
inequitable.
and that truly serves the needs of the American people.
Now let's shift gears a bit.
And talk about some alternatives to these refund checks.
If the goal is to address government overspending,
Are there other ways to use those funds?
that might be more beneficial in the long run.
That's a great question.
Instead of just giving the money back to taxpayers,
What else could the government do?
well, they could invest it in things that would have a lasting impact.
Like what?
Infrastructure, for example.
Roads, bridges, airports,
Things that make our lives easier and more efficient.
and that create jobs.
Exactly.
Or they could invest in education
Make sure our kids have the resources they need
to succeed in school.
and to compete in the global economy.
And we can't forget about healthcare.
Making sure everyone has access to quality, affordable care.
That's essential.
There are so many possibilities.
It really comes down to what we value as a society.
What are our priorities?
And that's why it's so important for all of us to be engaged
To make our voices heard.
and to hold our elected officials accountable
We need to let them know what matters to us.
and what we want to see happen with our tax dollars.
It's not enough to just sit back and complain
We need to be active participants.
in shaping the future of our country. So it really comes down to a personal choice.
Yeah. Would you rather have that extra cash in your pocket?
Or would you prefer to see that money go towards something bigger?
Like investing in the future.
Exactly. Infrastructure, education, healthcare.
These are things that could benefit everyone in the long run.
It's not just about your own personal finances
It's about what you think the role of government should be.
and what kind of future you want to see for our country.
It's a big question.
And there's no right or wrong answer.
Everyone has their own priorities.
And their own vision for what America should be.
But that's what makes this whole conversation so interesting.
It forces us to think about these big issues
To grapple with different perspectives.
and to try to find common ground.
And ultimately,
That's what democracy is all about.
it's messy and it's complicated
But it's the best system we've got.
for making sure that everyone's voice is heard.
So as we wrap up this
We
conversation,
want to leave you with one final thought.
imagine a world where the government actually runs efficiently.
Like a well-oiled machine.
No waste, no fraud, no unnecessary spending,
Just a laser focus on using taxpayer dollars.
to achieve the best possible outcomes.
A government that's truly accountable to the people.
A government that works for us.
Not against us.
In that kind of world?
Would refund checks even be necessary?
Or would those funds be better spent?
On building a brighter future for everyone?
It's something to think about.
It's a challenge we can all work on together.
If you enjoyed this conversation,
And you want to stay informed about future episodes?
make sure you're subscribed.
And if you found this episode valuable,
hit that like button and share it with your friends.
we appreciate you being part of this journey with us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged.
And keep those wheels turning.